If you're trying to decide between procedural level generation versus pre-made levels for a small scoped project, this video is for you. This comes to us from a question from a member of Home Team Game Dev, a group of online game developers who I support. This is a multiple-time project lead, excellent programmer, and so it comes from an experience level, not totally new to this stuff, but trying to balance his trade-offs, and it's something we've had come up a lot of times over the hundreds of games we worked on over the years, so I want to share it here, both to bounce his way, but then also to call up in the future when these questions come up again. I assume you kind of got the gist, but procedural level generation, basically some version of random generation, randomly generating maps, new levels, new patterns, new enemy ships, whatever genre of game you're looking at, as opposed to pre-made being we placed where are the mountains, where are the objectives, where are the bases, where are the enemies. And depending on the genre, sometimes procedural is more or less tricky to do. Structural, architectured kind of environments, layouts, land, terrain have whole other complexity to it that may not be the case for a game that's just kind of ships flying on screen, but the same conclusion here is going to apply. And what I'm going to suggest, and actually let me first base it in the root of his question, his goal here is to maximize replayability while minimizing the dev time costs within the limited scope allowances of a small project like this one. Procedural generation seems like it would be pretty simple on the surface, since the level at this point is little more than, in his case, kind of some free-floating object stuff. We just need to skew the randomized numbers generally to land in appropriate parameters, while still allowing enough freedom and wacky coincidences to keep things interesting. From what he's heard, most of the work in any kind of procedural generation involves exactly that tuning the numbers, which usually sounds like it takes much more work and effort than new developers tend to think it will. Exact kind of thoughts I hear coming from people who are trying to figure this out, and what I would tend to suggest, first of all, is to acknowledge again, depending on the purpose of your project. If you're trying to make a commercial project, the answer may be different. My focus is often on what's good for you as a developer. Assuming that this is not a funded project, that you're just trying to learn stuff, then part of the interest may be, does one or the other interest you? Do you have an interest in learning level design? Do you just flat out not and you want to avoid it? Do you have an interest in learning some things about procedural generation? Or kind of not care about that side of things? Part of why we design our projects is to play to our own interests and motivations. A huge part of what makes my kind of teaching approach possible is because I'm helping people do things they actually care to want to do. They want to make that game, they want to complete that feature. If you don't have that motivation there because it's just the opposite approach you care for, that's kind of its own answer in part, even if ultimately, and let's be blunt, it might result in some sense, an inferior product. The product isn't the point, right? It's our practice, it's our development, it's did we make a thing we wanted to? Did we learn skills we care about? Do we demonstrate in our portfolio things we want to speak to, if that's the shape of what we're doing? But at a higher level of consideration, and where we've tended to see for a lot of the games, including games I've led and released way over 100 over the years, but even so, let's say like something that could have been simple, procedural, of made like a shmup with ships flying on screen, you tend to wind up with a couple of challenges there. The first being of what Kate Compton, she used to be might still be in some ways, procedural generation researcher in California. These days, I believe, with Lego, doing some pretty awesome work. But Kate Compton has this awesome word about procedural generation that was partly inspired, or I first saw it in the discussion around when No Man's Sky was new. And this isn't trashing on No Man's Sky. I love what it's become. But it had this thing where it had like 14 quintillion planets or whatever, and she described the infinite unique bowls of oatmeal problem, meaning that, yeah, they're all different, but just like a bowl of oatmeal, it's very, very hard in the nuances. They kind of all come together into a mush to tell why is one is different than the other. And this is something that, again, out of an example of levels in that game, hills were different heights and different shades of green versus blue, and the trees were more or less spaced out. But for a lot of players, especially earlier on when the game was still new, there was a feeling that there's a sameness to it. And this is one of the dangers of procedural generation, is that even if we get something that kind of feels right, it winds up feeling right in a pretty recurring, predictable way. It doesn't have that surprise. It doesn't have that massive shift in feel that we get from handcrafted experiences, whether or not a level is supposed to be playing to the verticality or the intensity, the claustrophobia, or as human beings, we're pretty good at picking distinct differences as designers of, is this experience about verticality? Is this experience about a certain item? Is this experience about a certain kind of enemy being focused? Procedural generation is going to tend to wind up being a level. It's kind of a muddy area in the middle. And even if it kind of works, we've really usually kind of designed one level or a generator of a single kind of level. So this is one of the dangers that we have. The other thing that winds up happening in the procedural generation versus hand design space is that very often there's a range out of how the levels may come out in terms of how the pacing and the spacing and the difficulty and things fit together. And the risk being, if all those numbers don't line up just right, you can kind of have a lot of dice rolls that just don't turn out that great, right? And so someone's first impression of the game may be not really it's showing its best strengths, not leading with the enemies appearing in the order that makes the most sense, not making structural sense of being the easiest to navigate for the way movement works. And so that risk is that when we aren't Capcom, we aren't Squaresoft, we aren't Nintendo, people don't have that trust that if it's kind of crummy out the gate, oh, I should just re-roll and try again. Maybe I got a bad draw. Their first impression is going to be this game isn't very good, and they're going to bounce. And so instead, what often winds up being useful, and this is honestly a process for when we're developing procedural generation anyway, it's better to kind of, if you hand lay out, what's like a best case scenario? What random way do you wish things would fall that you'd feel good about? I'm glad that's the version that they saw in terms of pacing, spacing, difficulty, order, sequence, etc. And one of the things we tend to find is that, again, so as part of the creation of a procedural generation system, part of the way you do that is you hand make spaces anyway as what are your ideals? So you can play against them. So you can test them out and feel like, is this something that's good? Is this an outcome I'd want? To then reverse engineer from that within what parameterization or randomization would make sense for that. Does that make sense? It's a necessary step to do good procedural generation, to do hand layout anyway. It's another layer of work after it, not necessarily instead of. It also means that again, you can then be in control of 100% of the time, people will have a better first impression when they play your game. This includes, right? So even if I check out the game and I like it, and I'm like, oh, my friend Tim would like this. I want to show Tim. That when I show Tim, Tim's also going to have a relatable, good, strong first impression. And I know there's this notion of like, again, we want replay value. I was a pinball researcher, so I totally get that. But often what's going on in these kind of cases is it's hard enough to make something have play value in the first place, right? Even especially when we're resource constrained, we're doing freeware, or we're doing kind of like this kind of scale of project. It's difficult enough to make a level that really people have a strong response to, that they like, that they feel good about. And we can tune and tweak that much finer in a handcrafted space than we can in a procedural, which again runs the risk of it just kind of falls out of feeling as strong, right? If we took is the reason why shows are pre-written, is the reason why a lot of the games that we love are handmade spaces. And so it is worth considering, can I make a stronger and consistent first impression I can calibrate against, versus the same ways you don't want to have a recipe that randomizes how much sugar, how much time in the oven. There's a way you want that to land for the best it can possibly be that shows off what your engine's capable of, what assets you have in the game that you're proud of in terms of art and sound and music and so on. So I would tend to encourage at this scale, it is better to have a smaller number of handcrafted level or levels, including even one, right, as a proof of concept. And it's also where it's the kind of thing where we're often trying to make a case, if not to the outside world, to ourselves. Does this have legs? Is this good? Do people wish there was more of this? And you're far better off served at the small project scale, kind of at a proof of concept thinking, so people will play it and wish there was more. Oh, this was good. I'm hungry for more of it. So you could follow up with an expansion. You can maybe add procedural generation in a future version. There might be more demand for that in a way that what you don't want is it to feel spread thin. There's 100 levels. There's infinite levels, but they don't feel that different. They don't feel that unique. They don't feel sensible. They don't feel like they are distinct from one another. That doesn't serve us. It just winds up being more confusing for them, winds up being harder for them to navigate, winds up losing some control that we could have, because as the creators of the project who know best how the movement works, how the enemies work, how the items work, we are in a situation to make those decisions for them, to make sure they have kind of a good curated first experience. In a way, again, it would be a bit like you went to a restaurant and they're trying to ask you how long you want it in the, I don't know, what temperature you want it, or how much salt to put on the fries, and in a kind of a very granular way. You're trusting the chef for that to some extent. And those are the things we're familiar with as opposed to the game space where we're having to make lots of these decisions. So I would encourage handcrafted in most cases, again, unless you just super want to avoid level design, don't have teammates who might be interested in doing level design. I think it's going to tend to work out best is what we've seen, that when we have games that try to go too much into procedural generation, it is both all kind of winds up feeling samey. It is at a high risk of not showing off the best strengths or the strong first impression. And it also just has kind of a downside of, from the outside of any craft, it can be a little black boxy about the complexity of it. This is true for people who don't make music thinking about music, people who don't do writing thinking about writing, people who don't do code thinking about code. Level design is its own craft to do well and to get right. There is nuance to it, and it is as difficult to get a machine to design a coherent, decent level through procedural generation as it is to do any of these other kind of things well, which even though we're seeing LLMs do some of this kind of stuff, it is again at a level of, it's impressive to someone who doesn't do that thing. It's not yet impressive to people who actually know how to write, how to make music, etc., and winds up lacking in ways that might be hard to put your fingers on as a non-expert, but the more you navigate into the space, the more you realize that there is depth to getting that right. And I think one of the best ways to learn that for our own internal strengths and understanding is through that handcrafted level design experience. So that's my suggestion, both in this member's case, but also more generally, it's when we tend to see this question come up, and it's come up a lot of times over the years, a lot of different genres. Better to make some handmade tracks than to randomly generate it. Better to make some handmade maps or environments or encounters or waves of ships where you're pacing at what frequency, with what density, from what angles, which enemies, than just purely randomize it. The other place I'll acknowledge that there is something to be considered for this, where it fits into the ecosystem of commercial games. If you care to take it that kind of direction, there is a difference of when it comes to the streamer community. One of the factors people consider is, if I just watch the game, is it worth me still playing? And so tactically, there is a difference there. Part of it is something that's like Minecraft had at the core of its appeal a long time ago, or multiplayer games inherently, by virtue of there being other players there, is that just because I've seen someone else play it, it will not be the same experience for me. There are cases where if a game is sufficiently linear, predictable, the same for everybody, someone might watch the game and then not feel a need to buy it because, well, I already saw every single thing exactly as it happened. I don't need to rewalk those steps. I would rather have my own unique journey. But again, this tends to be another level up. I would think of it as, can your smaller freeware practice, personal project, etc., if it's a game in home team game dev, make the case for people want more of this? Then it gets easier to then throw more time on top of it into thinking about how procedural generation could best serve those kinds of goals. Now, the other thing I'm going to end on here is a quick note about, again, the context for this is home team game dev. For those who aren't familiar with it, that's my main work. We have people scattered around the globe who are just part-time making what they want to make for different reasons. We got people doing it for portfolio filling in. We got people doing it for personal enrichment, that they like to know and do these sort of things. They find it satisfying to make pixel art and make music and have a context to put it in a game that gets released. And also people who there's always just games that they want to make. And this is an environment of having collaborators help to turn to, myself and various specialist trainers in art, audio, music, writers, UI, a lot of different kind of skill areas of support trainers who have backgrounds, so people schedule calls where they get help. And ever the teams are supported, everything releases on time. We've done this now for over 200 games in the past almost 10 years now. If you're interested in joining this, it's a group anybody can apply to. Find out the details at hometeamgamedev.com, how it all works. Would love to work with you directly. All the learning takes place in the context of on these projects. So real questions come up with real implications for real things we're building. And I'm excited to see the game that this member's building. And we've also got other pitches coming up, which release another game. Lots of great things happening in Home Team. Anyway, that's it for the day. Thanks for tuning in. Hope this helps somebody out there. I would encourage you to consider and try first handmade level design. I also think, as a former professional level designer 20 years ago, early in my career, it will make your procedural generation much better if you get a handle on how to do it by hand before you start looking that direction too much. Anyway, that's it for now. Catch you next time. Bye for now.